I am Rebecca. I am 28 years old and work in the sales department of a system-related company. My company has a lot of business trips and I work overtime every day. The work itself is harsh, but what's worse is that most of the employees, including the president, have a sloppy attitude towards work. Especially, Mr. Morris, the manager who is my boss, was too bad. He would dump his work on his subordinates and not go to sales, and spend the whole day browsing the internet at his desk. In such an environment, I tried to achieve results with a serious attitude. However, for some reason, Mr. Morris didn't seem to like me. Finally, he caused a big incident that involved the company beyond my imagination. I hate to say it myself, but I was one of the few employees who worked hard since I joined the company. People who worked diligently quit one after another because they couldn't stand the terrible working conditions. As a result, the company's performance gradually declined. But the president didn't try to change the situation and didn't seem to have a sense of crisis. The word of job change was always on my mind, but I couldn't take the first step. I desperately worked on system development and ran around for sales every day because I joined the company with great expectations. And as I was working quietly by myself as usual, Mr. Morris called my name. Whenever Mr. Morris called me, nothing good ever happened. Because he was the most troublesome person in this department. He would steal the credit from his subordinates or blame them for his mistakes. It was a daily occurrence. I went to Mr. Morris's desk cautiously when he called my name. He told me to go on a business trip as his proxy from tomorrow. Apparently, he had received a request for system improvement from a client he was in charge of. But I had a lot of work to finish by the end of this week. I told him that, but he said it wouldn't be a problem if I finished all my work by today. There was a lot of work and I didn't know if I could finish it by today. When I hesitated, Mr. Morris told me not to disobey my boss's orders and used his position to pressure me. He also said that he had already contacted the other party and told them that I would be coming as his proxy. So I had no choice but to go on a business trip as Mr. Morris's proxy. I couldn't afford to inconvenience the other party, so I reluctantly agreed. Then he smiled triumphantly and told me to listen to him obediently from the beginning. That day, I worked until late at night and somehow finished my work and headed to the destination the next day. The person in charge of the client company was a very successful salesman who had a good reputation. As soon as I reviewed the system and made changes to make it easier to use, he was very satisfied and praised me for my excellent work.
I've asked your company to review the system before, but I've never seen anyone as talented as you, Rebecca!
He complimented me so much that I was happy. I was hardly ever appreciated for my work in the company, so I was so happy that I teared up. The client manager who saw me introduced me to someone. She was someone who might have a big impact on my future life. She told me to think about it and gave me her contact information. And 3 days later, when I returned from the business trip, exhausted and worn out, I saw a shocking sight. My desk was gone. I couldn't comprehend the situation and stood there dumbfounded. Mr. Morris came up to me with a smirk on his face. He told me not to come into the company as an outsider. I was too tired from the business trip and the daily overtime to think clearly. I asked Mr. Morris, who was still yelling at me to get out, what was going on. He said,
"You didn't come to the company for 3 days, but you came back now. How dare you suddenly slack off your work? Do you think you can get away with it? We don't need useless employees like you. You're done."
I didn't understand what he meant, and I asked him why I was slacking off when he asked me to go on a business trip. He said,
"The client you went to was originally my responsibility, you know? So the results of the work are obviously my credit." Ha ha! I told the upper management that I went on a business trip and did the work.
I couldn't believe his words. I panicked and said that it was impossible for him. He laughed maliciously at me.
Do you think that common sense works in this company? You were obedient at first, but you became rebellious lately. That's your fault. We don't need subordinates who don't listen to their boss.
I felt dizzy from his words. I worked hard every day, but this was too much. I started to tremble with anger at his outrageous behavior. He continued arrogantly.
By the way, I thought you quit because you didn't come to the company. You're useless anyway, so I processed your resignation letter.
It is impossible to submit a resignation letter without the person being present. When I asked what was going on, Mr. Morris said he had submitted a resignation letter on my behalf without my consent. And to my surprise, the president accepted it. At this point, I was so disgusted that I couldn't close my mouth. I don't care what happens to this company anymore. I swore in my heart that I would send this selfish and tyrannical Mr. Morris and the company to hell. You're ready for this, huh? I won't show any mercy. As I remained silent, Mr. Morris got carried away and continued.
I feel refreshed now that there's no one like you who can't be flexible. Of course, don't expect any severance pay, okay? There's no way someone like you who didn't do any decent work can get a proper severance pay.
I asked Mr. Morris, who was spouting unbelievable remarks, if he really wouldn't regret it.
Why would I regret anything? Just get out of here. You're useless now.
He laughed loudly. Is that so? Then I'll ruin this company. When I said that,
Huh?
he looked puzzled and couldn't understand.
Hey, did you go crazy after becoming unemployed all of a sudden? There's no way you have that kind of power.
He yelled at me. You'll regret it for sure, I said and left the company. And I headed to a major system company with my feet. It was a company run by a close friend of the manager I met at the business trip destination that Mr. Morris ordered me to go 3 days ago. I called the contact number I received from the manager. Then, a female president with a crisp voice answered me. When I explained the situation, she invited me to the company and talked to me in person. And I told her what happened at the company. She was very angry at the terrible response of the company. And she made me an offer and told me a surprising fact. A few months later, I woke up to the sound of my cell phone ringing many times in the morning. When I checked the call history, it was from my former workplace where I was fired. There were already more than 30 missed calls on my cell phone, and when the phone rang again, I reluctantly answered it. Then,
Hey, what the hell is going on?
I heard Mr. Morris's voice shouting at me. What is it? I think I have nothing to do with your company anymore? I answered with annoyance, and Mr. Morris seemed confused and started talking without any coherence.
This morning, the president suddenly said that this company was going to be acquired. And most of the employees might be fired. The president said it was because you were fired.
When I heard that, I laughed out loud as I expected. Mr. Morris got angry and asked me why I was laughing. Didn't you know anything about the situation of your company, Mr. Morris? I asked calmly, and he seemed puzzled by what I was talking about. Your company's management was declining year by year, you know? You had fewer and fewer clients than before. And that's why you couldn't maintain your business, right? He denied it and panicked. but I told him that this was an undeniable fact. Of course, the president must have known the situation, but he didn't seem to have any sense of crisis and was reluctant to reform the company and abandoned his responsibility.
But I've never heard that we were in such a critical situation before. And there were some companies that wanted to do business with us, right?
He was frantic and incredulous. Well, that's true. But wasn't that because the system I made was popular? The reason why the company could keep its business even though the president was like that was actually largely thanks to the system I made. By introducing the system, a lot of waste was reduced and the work was improved, and it was well received by many companies, and it contributed greatly to the company's sales.
But that doesn't mean we can be acquired all of a sudden. If we had kept selling the system as before.
He said that, but I asked him coldly. Let me ask you this. Is there anyone else who can manage the system besides me? He choked when he heard that. I was the only one who worked hard in my department, and of course I didn't hand over anything when I was fired. In such a situation, would there be any companies that would sign contracts with them as before? Even the stupid former manager could see the answer.
Then, why don't you come back?
He tried to patch things up as if he had an idea, but of course I refused firmly. That's not a joke. I will never go back. After all, it was Mr. Morris who suddenly fired me. And yet, he tells me to come back when he's in trouble. How selfish is that? No, thank you. Mr. Morris panicked at my words, but I didn't care. I coldly brushed him off, and he said,
Fine. I'll cancel the firing that I did with my authority. I think the president will hire you back right away if you do. And don't you want to get a job soon?
He tried to persuade me desperately, but I told him, I don't need that. I already have a new job. It's a major system company that plans to acquire your company. The former manager was stunned and called me a traitor. Actually, I was introduced to the president of the major system company at the business trip destination that Mr. Morris asked me to go to before. When I told her how I had been treated unfairly at the company, she was very angry and said she couldn't forgive it as a company in the same industry. She was also very interested in the system I made and its rights. The major system company welcomed me with a smile and asked me to join them as soon as possible when I told them how I was fired. In addition, the acquisition talk was already going on between the presidents. I told him that the result wouldn't change even if I went back. Then Mr. Morris started to flatter me.
Then, you can contact the female president, right? Then, can you please do something to get me hired too? They must want someone as talented as me, right? I don't want to be unemployed after I've been promoted so smoothly.
I laughed at Mr. Morris's words. Mr. Morris has talent? That's a joke, right? I've never heard of that. You spent the whole day without going to sales or developing systems, just browsing the internet. You have too high self-esteem, don't you? Mr. Morris was silent on the other end of the phone, maybe because my words were too harsh. Besides, the president is a very strict person, you know? She's a person who evaluates people by their abilities, and she doesn't seem to have any intention of hiring employees who don't have any past achievements. Mr. Morris was desperate and said,
No way!
And Mr. Morris is the one who framed me, right? Why do I have to help someone like that? I'm sorry, but I'm not that kind either. I said that firmly, And Mr. Morris changed his attitude.
I'm sorry. Isn't this enough? Please ask the president to hire me.
He begged me, but I didn't accept it at all. I don't need your apology now. And if you want to work for our company so badly, why don't you take the entrance exam? Well, I think people who have been slacking off will fail. It's time to pay the price for looking down on your work. Give up and accept it. Mr. Morris couldn't say anything at the end. I heard him sniffling on the other side of the phone, so he must be lamenting his miserable future. I was able to tell him everything I wanted to say, and I hung up the phone feeling refreshed. After that, my former workplace was acquired by a major system company as planned. Most of the employees who didn't do any work were fired. A handful of employees who worked hard and achieved results like me were rehired. Mr. Morris also tried to stick around, but of course he had no achievements or results and was fired as well. He lost his job suddenly and panicked to find a new one, but he lacked the experience and knowledge to get a job in the same system industry. He ended up having to live on day labor jobs. The former president also intended to escape alone after being acquired, but he couldn't repay his debts that had piled up from repeated business failures, and he was chased by debt collectors. On the other hand, I got along with my new workplace and was able to work in a much better environment than before. If Mr. Morris hadn't forced me to go on a business trip at that time, I wouldn't have met this wonderful connection, so I'm grateful to him for that. I want to keep working hard and contribute to the new company.
How did you like this story? Please also subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.